The first bell had long ago fallen silent, yet the wind still remembered its voice. Before the sun rose, before color returned to the world, the valley lay frozen in a blue half-light, and the air carried that brittle cold which makes every breath feel borrowed. Frost clung to the grass like a shroud. The earth did not stir. Even the birds seemed to hesitate. And there, against the low hills, the monastery stood. Not proud, not holy, broken, a pale scar on the land. Its stones were the color of old bone, crusted with lichen and forgotten prayers. The tower leaned slightly, as if weary of holding the sky. The belfry gaped open, ribs exposed, where iron once sang the hours of God. Now only crows nested in its throat, their black wings rustling like pages turned by unseen hands. When the wind slipped through the cloister arches, it carried the smell of wet limestone, of stale wax, and something sour beneath it. Rot. Like grain forgotten in a cellar. Like bread that no one came back to bake. The path that led to the gatehouse had almost disappeared. Moss swallowed it inch by inch, patient as time. Once, pilgrims climbed here with bleeding heels and cracked lips, clutching rosaries carved from olive wood, whispering Latin prayers through chattering teeth. Their voices must have risen like smoke, thin and hopeful. Now thistles bowed where they had knelt. The gate chain lay rusted in the grass like a dead serpent, curled and stiff. Its links fused together as though it had died defending something no one remembered. Inside, the silence was not empty. It was watchful. The cloister's fountain had run dry decades ago. The basin held only leaves and brittle twigs. The carved saints along its rim had lost their faces to winter, noses chipped away, eyes hollowed, mouths erased. Time had punished them for witnessing too much. A single sandal rested beside the well, small, stiff with age, as if someone had stepped out of it and simply vanished. The wind moved again, and the corridors answered with a low murmur, like breath through broken teeth. Once, this place had been alive with obedience, with rhythm, with ritual. Before dawn, ovens glowed red. Bread rose and split open with soft sighs. Fish were salted and stacked in wooden barrels. Garlic hung in braids from the beams. The air smelled of smoke and sheep's milk and ink. Monks walked these stones in brown wool habits, their sandals slapping quietly against the floor. Heads shaved, hands rough and cracked, fingers stained black from soot and honey as they ground their pigments for the manuscripts. They spoke little. They did not need to. The bells spoke for them. Matins, lauds, vespers. Each toll a command from heaven. Each note a reminder that time belonged to God. And they obeyed. They always obeyed. But now, even the memory of those bells felt distant, like thunder from a storm that had already drowned the fields. The chapel doors hung crooked on their hinges, swollen from years of rain. The carvings on them, once angels, once vines, had been eaten through like parchment left too long in damp air. When pushed, they groaned softly, a sound too human, too tired. Inside, the nave stretched long and hollow. Light filtered through cracked windows in thin silver blades. Dust floated like ash. The altar cloth had rotted into lace. Candlesticks lay toppled on their sides, green with corrosion. Someone had tried to scrape the floor clean long ago. There were marks, desperate circular strokes, as if something had spilled there, something they did not want remembered. The silence here was not the gentle quiet of prayer. It was the kind that follows a scream. In the scriptorium, broken desks leaned against one another like old men. Scraps of vellum curled in the corners, brittle as autumn leaves. A single jar of ink had dried solid, the surface cracked into a black desert. On the wall, a half-finished manuscript remained pinned beneath a stone. A saint's hand, painted in careful gold, reached toward heaven. But the rest of the body had never been completed, as if the artist had been called away mid-breath, or had dropped the brush and run. The wind pressed through the corridor again, colder now, threading through the arches, brushing against skin like fingers. It carried whispers that weren't there. Footsteps that never quite formed. And deeper inside, near the apse, the air changed. It grew heavier. Thicker, as though the stones themselves were holding their breath. There, hidden behind a curtain of ivy and shadow, stood the wall. A small doorway had once been carved into the foundation, a servant's passage perhaps, or a storage cell. But someone had sealed it, bricked it shut. The mortar was newer than the rest, sloppier. The stones misaligned, hurried, as though set by trembling hands. This was not the work of patient monks. This was fear made solid. A burial of space rather than bone. No prayer marked it, no cross, only a patch of wall that did not belong. The kind of place you avoid looking at too long. The kind of place your body understands before your mind does. Something had happened here. Not death alone, death was common, almost sacred. This was something else, something they had not wanted God to see. The wind struck the hollow corridors again, and the monastery murmured back, a low, uneven breath. Not empty, not abandoned. Waiting, beyond the walls, the valley remained still beneath its frost. The hills watched in silence, ancient and unmoved. They had seen the monks arrive generations ago with their books and bells and fragile faith. They had seen the smoke from their kitchens, heard their hymns climb into the sky. And they had seen the night it ended. Though no one alive remembered how. The earth remembered. The stones remembered. Even the wind remembered. It circled the tower and slipped through the broken belfry where the iron bell once hung, and for just a moment, in the hollow of that empty space, the air trembled, as if the bell might ring again, as if time itself were about to speak. But it didn't. Only the crows stirred, and the frost tightened its grip on the grass. And somewhere beyond the monastery walls, down in the sleeping valley, smoke began to rise from distant chimneys. People still lived here, still farmed, still prayed. Unaware that the old place above them was watching, keeping its secrets like a witness too afraid to testify. And as the first thin light of morning bled over the hills, touching the ruined stones with a faint gold, it felt less like sunrise and more like something waking. Snow fell without sound, feathering the broken roof tiles until the monastery looked almost gentle, like a body tucked beneath a white shroud. For a moment, the ruin seemed peaceful, forgiven, as though whatever had happened here had finally been buried beneath winter. Then, the wind shifted, and the bell tower gave a low, hollow moan, and the illusion died. A lone figure climbed the ridge. His cloak snapped behind him like a torn banner. His boots sank deep into the drifts, each step swallowed and erased before the next could follow. He moved carefully, measuring distance with habit rather than sight, one hand gripping the leather tube at his belt where parchment slept, the other clutching a charcoal stick worn to half its size. A cartographer. Young. Too young for this silence. Sent from the king's court, with orders stamped in red wax, measure the lands, mark the holdings, count what could still be taxed. Fields, rivers, ruins, even God's abandoned houses. The crown had little patience for ghosts, but the villagers below had not given him directions. They had only crossed themselves. Old women had spat over their shoulders. A man at the mill had whispered something in the dialect older than the kingdom itself, a word that sounded less like a name and more like a warning. When he asked again, they fell quiet, eyes fixed on the ridge, as if the stones themselves might hear. So he climbed alone. The orchard greeted him first. Or what remained of it. Rows of skeletal trees clawed at the sky, branches twisted and black. Once pears had grown here, sweet winter fruit for fasting months, for broth and bread. Now the bark peeled like scab skin. Snow clung to every limb. His breath fogged the air, and for a strange instant, he smelled smoke. Warm bread. Ash. Memory playing tricks. He told himself it was imagination. Yet the scent lingered, faint and bitter, like something long extinguished. He reached the gatehouse and paused. The chain lay where it had fallen years ago, frozen into the earth, red with rust. Snow gathered in its loops. He stepped over it carefully, as though it might still bite. Inside, the monastery opened around him like a mouth. The silence pressed close, thicker than the cold. He had known monasteries before. As a child, during the famine years, his mother had walked miles to one such place. He remembered the brothers' hands, cracked, flour-dusted, passing her a heel of bread wrapped in linen. He remembered their voices, low and steady, chanting through the night like a second heartbeat for the world. To him, monasteries had always meant shelter, order, mercy. This place offered none of those things. The refectory table still stood, heavy oak, blackened with age. He brushed the surface with his glove and uncovered old knife marks, shallow grooves where novices once cut barley loaves. A bowl remained at one place, cracked down the middle. Inside it, the crust of something gray and fossilized clung stubbornly to the clay. Porridge. Left mid-meal. He felt suddenly like an intruder, like someone stepping into a house where the family had just stepped out and never returned. He pulled the parchment from his belt and tried to sketch the layout. Cloister. Chapel. Dormitory. His hand trembled, not from cold alone, because this was not the slow decay of poverty, not the gentle retreat of years. This felt abrupt. Interrupted. Ledgers were missing from the shelves. Hooks on the wall where reliquaries once hung were empty. The altar had been stripped clean of silver and glass, the stones scraped bare. It wasn't looting. It was evacuation. The careful removal of anything holy, anything worth saving, as though they had fled in the dark with only what they could carry. He stepped into the dormitory. Rows of straw pallets lined the walls. The straw had collapsed into damp, sour-smelling clumps. His boots whispered across the floorboards. Then he saw it. Near one nail, fibers tangled and stiff. Rope. Frayed. Darkened. Long enough to bind wrists. He touched it. The strands cracked softly between his fingers like old bone. A cold thought slid into his mind, quiet and unwelcome. Not prayer. Not fasting. Binding. Beneath one pallet, the earth bulged slightly. He crouched and brushed the dirt aside. The soil had been disturbed once, then packed down again. Not a grave, too shallow, more like something hidden, or something forced down. His heartbeat filled his ears. The monastery seemed to lean closer. He told himself he was imagining it. Yet, the air felt different here. Heavy. Listening. He knelt and pressed his ear to the boards. At first, nothing. Then, a hollow, a deep, patient silence beneath the stone, like an empty chamber, or a throat waiting to speak. He pulled back quickly, breath shaking. Outside, the snow thickened. Through the cracked window, he watched it fall faster now, erasing his footprints one by one, covering his path, sealing him in. As though the world below had already forgotten, he was here. He moved toward the chapel again, drawn by something he could not name. The bricked doorway near the apse waited in shadow. The mortar was still wrong. Too new. Too hurried. He brushed snowmelt from the stones. One brick shifted slightly under his touch. Loose. Behind it, The darkness seemed deeper than it should have been. Not the darkness of a small room, but of space. Breathing space. He imagined the brothers working by torchlight, hands shaking, sealing this passage while the bells screamed above them. Imagined whispers. Faster. Before nightfall. Before it spreads, what had they hidden? A relic? A sin? Or something that had once worn a human face? The wind rushed through the broken arches, and the corridors answered, murmuring like a prayer spoken through clenched teeth. He realized then that the villagers had not refused to name this place out of superstition. They refused because naming is remembering. And remembering brings things back. Snow layered the courtyard, smoothing edges, softening ruin into beauty. From a distance, the monastery might almost look holy again, almost harmless. The cartographer stood alone in the whiteness, parchment damp in his hand, ink bleeding slowly into the fibers. He had come to measure land, to draw borders, to turn stone and soil into numbers. But this place resisted measurement. It felt less like a ruin and more like a wound the earth had tried and failed to close. The bell tower groaned again in the wind. For an instant, he thought he heard a tone, low, metallic, trembling, a bell that no longer existed. Calling no one. Or calling something back. Snow swallowed the last trace of his tracks. The valley disappeared behind a curtain of white, and as he slipped the loose brick from the wall and peered into the narrow black opening beyond, the monastery seemed to fold inward around him, like a ribcage closing over a fragile heart, keeping whatever slept inside from ever being measured. Or known. Evening entered the chapel like diluted wine. Slow. Red, bleeding through the fractured windows and spreading across the stone in long, trembling stains. For a moment it looked like fresh blood, like something wounded and still warm. The last light of day slid between the ribs of the vaulted ceiling, catching the drifting dust and turning it gold, as though the air itself were filled with ash from a fire long extinguished. The chapel breathed out the faint scent of incense, dry and bitter, clinging stubbornly to the pews, to the altar, to the grain of the wood. Smoke that had nowhere else to go. Smoke that had waited decades for lungs. A mouse skittered across the altar steps, tiny claws clicking like beads of a rosary. It disturbed a scatter of petals so brittle they broke at the slightest touch. Flowers once laid with care, now the color of old paper. Even the offerings had aged into ghosts. Outside, the snow was beginning to melt, dripping from the eaves in slow, hollow taps. Inside, the quiet thickened. And into that quiet, she came. Alone, wrapped in a patched cloak the color of earth. Gray hair escaping from beneath her hood like threads pulled loose from an old tapestry. Her steps were small, careful, reverent, as though she expected a voice to scold her at any moment. As though the abbess might still be watching from the shadows, lips thin, eyes sharp as sewing needles. Time had bent her back, but not her memory. This place had shaped her bones. She had once been a novice here, a girl with chapped hands and lowered eyes, scrubbing these very stones before dawn until her fingers split and bled into the water. She had knelt until her knees hardened like leather. She had memorized hymns in Latin she never understood, the words rolling over her tongue like pebbles from a distant shore. Faith had been sound, not meaning. She remembered the taste of turnips and rye bread eaten in silence, the way spoons never scraped too loudly against bowls, the way the bell tolled above them, measuring their lives into neat, obedient hours. And always, the keys, the weight of them at the abbess's belt, a heavy ring of iron teeth that jangled with every step, the sound of authority, law, punishment, mercy. The keys decided which doors opened, and which did not. She moved down the aisle now, fingertips brushing the pews as if greeting old friends long buried. The wood was splintered, scarred by time. Her touch left faint streaks in the dust. she could almost hear them again. Girls whispering after lights out. The soft scrape of spinning wheels. Laughter swallowed quickly when footsteps approached. This had not only been a monastery, it had been refuge. For girls with no dowry, widows with nowhere to sleep, orphans folded away from the world like unwanted letters. They had spun wool until their wrists ached, tended herb beds heavy with rosemary and sage, brewing teas for fevers and childbirth, copied texts by candlelight, ink staining their sleeves black as night. They had been told obedience was salvation, silence was safety. And most of them believed it, because believing hurt less than asking why. She paused near the scriptorium door. Her reflection trembled faintly in a shard of broken glass. And beneath the memory of hymns and bread and spinning wool, something colder stirred. Something she had tried all her life not to recall. There had been a cellar. Beneath the scriptorium. A place no one spoke of. Barrels stored there that were never opened. The abbess kept that key separate from the others, tied with red thread. The air that slipped from beneath the door had always smelled wrong. Metallic. Sweet, like coins left too long in the mouth. As a girl, she had once lingered too close. She remembered the abbess's voice, low and sharp. Not there, just 2 words, enough to freeze her blood. Then the sickness came to the valley, not the kind with coughing and sores, not the familiar misery of plague. This was quieter. People who seemed well at sunset were dead by morning. Livestock foaming at the mouth, water tasting bitter. The priests called it God's testing, the villagers called it curse, and at night, the carts arrived. She remembered that most clearly. Wheels wrapped in cloth to muffle the sound, lanterns hooded, men speaking in whispers, bodies wrapped tight in sailcloth, shapes too small, too many. Not just peasants, not just strangers. Some wore habits, some wore wool veils. She had counted once from her window. 1, 2, 7. Then stopped counting. The abbess had taken the red thread key. Gone below. Locked the door. And the next morning, the keys were gone. Vanished. The ring that ruled everything. Gone as if swallowed by the earth itself. After that, the bells stopped ringing. Doors were left open. And by winter, the monastery emptied like a lung exhaling its last breath. Now she stood before that place again. The trapdoor. Half rotted. The wood soft and blackened with age. An iron ring lay flush against it, cold and dull as a coin on a dead man's eyes. She knelt slowly. Her knees cracked. Her fingers trembled as they hovered above the metal. Not from cold. From memory. The chapel seemed to lean inward, listening. The air tasted older here. Heavier. As though something below still exhaled. Waiting. She imagined the cellar in darkness. Barrels. Cloth-wrapped shapes. Prayers whispered too late. What had they sealed down there? Disease? Sin? Or truth too terrible to survive daylight? From the rafters, a bird suddenly burst loose, wings beating frantic against the silence. Feathers brushed the stone. Dust spiraled. It found the shattered window and escaped into the fading sky. Freedom in a single desperate motion. She watched it vanish into the dusk. And in that instant, she understood. Some doors are not locked to protect the living. They are locked to imprison what the living cannot bear to remember. Her hand lowered. But she did not pull. Not yet. Beneath her feet, the ground seemed to breathe. A slow, patient rise and fall, as though the earth itself remembered the weight of what it carried. Outside, the last light died. The chapel darkened to the color of dried blood. And somewhere beyond the hills, a distant bell began to toll. Not from this monastery, but from the valley below, where others still prayed, still trusted stone walls and holy names. Unaware that, beneath this forgotten house, beneath her trembling hand, something older than prayer, waited to be opened. Rain slid down the stone like tears that never reached the earth. It gathered along the cracked cornices, pooled in the hollows of saints' faces, and fell in slow, patient drops into the mud below, as though the sky itself were grieving something it could not name. The monastery crouched beside the forest like an animal too tired to flee. Ivy strangled the arches, thick and muscular, roots burrowing into mortar as if trying to pull the walls back into the soil. The cloister paths had vanished beneath green. The windows were blind, with moss. And from the tower, the bell rope hung, frayed, mold black, swaying though the air was still. Each small movement sent the clapper tapping faintly inside the bell. A thin, accidental toll. Not a ring, more like a throat clearing. A ghost trying to remember how to speak. The sound was so slight it might have been mistaken for dripping water, but it repeated. Again. Again. A patient knocking from above, as though the tower refused to forget its purpose, as though time itself were tugging at the cord. Through the rain, a man approached along the old forest track. He walked with a limp that made his steps uneven, one boot dragging slightly through the mud. His cloak was patched leather, stiff with age and weather. An iron buckle on his scabbard knocked softly against his thigh with each step. A soldier once, now something else. His beard was streaked with gray. A scar cut through his brow like a lightning strike frozen in flesh. His eyes did not wander. They measured. He had seen too much to be surprised by ruins. Still, when the monastery came into view, his breath slowed. Not fear, recognition. He had come here years ago, after the war, after the smoke, after the villages that burned so bright at night, they looked like second suns. He had followed the smell of charred timber and wet blood for weeks, had slept with screams lodged behind his eyes. Every time he closed them, he saw roofs collapsing, heard children calling for mothers who would never answer. So he had climbed this hill, empty-handed, and asked to stay. The brothers had given him bread, a bowl of thin soup. Silence. No questions. He had taken vows not out of faith, but exhaustion. If God wanted him, God could have what was left. For years he had tended sheep in the lower pastures, mended the walls where frost cracked the stone, carried water from the well, spoke little. The rhythm of bells had steadied him. Matins. Lauds. Vespers. Each told a fence around his thoughts. Inside those hours, the memories could not roam. He learned the language of penance, kneeling on stone until skin split, fasting until ribs showed like the slats of a broken barrel, confessing dreams no priest could cleanse. But the quiet had held. For a time. Then the winter came when the bishop arrived. He remembered that day as clearly as the first wound he ever took. Hoofbeats in the snow, silk cloaks instead of wool, strangers with wax seals dangling from their belts and chests heavy with iron locks. They did not bow their heads when entering the chapel. They looked around as if inspecting a barn. Words followed them like smoke. Heresy. Forbidden texts. Deviation. They spoke as though the air itself were contaminated. The library was searched first. Shelves overturned. Manuscripts lifted like diseased animals, their bindings cut open, pages shaken out as though treason might fall free like dust. Ink-stained fingers trembled. No one protested. Protest meant suspicion. Suspicion meant rope. A young brother, thin, soft-voiced, always copying maps of distant coasts, was taken at dawn. Hood pulled tight over his head. Hands bound. The soldier remembered that boy's smile. He had once carved a wooden flute for him. Just questioning, the bishop had said. Not punishment. Not execution. Only truth. Yet that night, the screams. They carried through the cloister like wolves. Not long, not loud, but sharp enough to split the air. And after that, something inside the monastery shifted. Prayers grew shorter. Eyes stayed lowered. Doors locked earlier. The bells sounded, hesitant, as though even they doubted what they were calling people toward. Now the soldier stepped through the gate alone. Rain soaked his shoulders, slid down the leather, found every scar. The cloister garden had collapsed into weeds and standing water. Sage and thyme once grew here, herbs for fevers, poultices for wounds. He used to crush them between his fingers, breathing in their sharp scent. Now the beds were drowned. The sheep pens lay caved in, wood rotted and split. No footprints marked the mud but his own. The place felt emptied not by time, but by removal, like a body stripped of organs. Inside the chapter house, the air tasted metallic. He stepped forward slowly. Prayer mats still lay scattered across the floor. He nudged one aside with his boot, and there, iron rings, bolted into the stone, thick, cold, half hidden beneath fabric meant for kneeling. His breath hitched. He crouched, brushing mud away. Scratches marked the floor around them, deep grooves, jagged, as though nails had scraped and scraped, trying to climb through rock itself. The bishop had called it purification. He remembered that word, spoken gently, almost kindly, as if cleansing a wound. But this did not feel like holiness. It felt like burial, like something done after mercy had already left. Rain tapped against the broken windows. The accidental toll of the bell drifted down again, thin, uncertain. He stood and walked toward the tower. The rope waited there, black with mold, fibers unraveling like old hair. He wrapped his hand around it. It was damp, cold, alive with memory. For a moment, he simply held it, feeling every year since he last touched it, feeling the weight of bells that once ordered the day. Then the rope trembled, not from wind, from his hand, and the bell above answered with a hollow note. Low, broken. The sound rolled through the corridors and returned to him, distorted, as though something deep within the monastery had echoed back. Not an echo, a reply. The soldier closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he saw the hooded boy again. The rings in the floor, the bishop's soft voice, purification. He realized then that this place had not been abandoned because of famine, not plague, not war. It had been emptied by fear, by the slow violence of men convinced they were righteous. The rain fell harder, the rope swayed, and somewhere beneath the stone, far below the chapter house, below the sealed doors and forgotten cells, something hollow seemed to answer again. A patient knocking, as though the past still pressed its fists against the walls, waiting for someone brave or foolish, enough to listen. He opened his eyes and pulled the rope once more. Mist crept low across the marsh like breath from an unseen mouth. It slid between the reeds and over the black water, swallowing edges, softening shapes, until the monastery became neither ruin nor stone nor memory. Only a shadow hunched against the horizon. From a distance it might have been a hill, or a cloud that had fallen and forgotten how to rise. The bell tower disappeared first. Then the arches. Then the windows, until only a pale suggestion remained, as if the world itself were trying to erase what stood there. The fishermen in the village below would not look at it after sunset. Their boats stayed tied to their posts, ropes creaking in the damp air. Nets lay folded like sleeping dogs. When asked why, they muttered into their beards and spat into the water. They said the marsh tasted wrong near the old walls, metallic, like blood on the tongue. They said that after storms, the reeds sometimes parted, and bones rose to the surface. Small ones, light as driftwood. Not the bones of cattle, not the bones of deer. Too delicate, too human. They did not fish there. Some waters, they said, remembered too much. At twilight, a single figure walked the narrow causeway that cut through the marsh. His boots sank into the peat with a wet sigh. Each step released the smell of rot and cold water, the scent of old leaves dissolving back into earth. He carried no weapon, only a satchel slung across his chest, heavy with glass and herbs that clinked softly together like fragile bells. A physician. Traveling. Thin as a reed himself, with ink stains on his cuffs and the pale hands of a man who had spent his life touching sickness rather than soil. He had been summoned by rumor. Nothing more. Whispers in taverns. Stories traded between mule drivers and widows. They spoke of the brothers here once, men who studied fevers like scholars studied stars. Men who tried things no priest would bless. Cures beyond God's permission. He had seen enough ports and plague ships to distrust superstition. He trusted only flesh. Symptoms. Patterns. But curiosity had always been stronger than caution. It had carried him through cities where half the streets were graveyards. It had carried him here. The gate opened easily when he pressed it. Not swollen with age, not locked. It moved with a tired groan, like a door recently used. That unsettled him more than any legend. Inside, the air felt warmer than the marsh, thick with a scent that had outlived the years. Vinegar, ash, boiled bone, the smell of care, and of something harsher. He followed it into the infirmary. Shelves still lined the walls, clay jars arranged with careful precision. Each labeled in neat Latin script, the ink faded but legible. Dried foxglove, crushed pearl, poppy resin, angelica root. Mortars rested on the tables, their bowls stained green and red from countless grindings. Pestles worn smooth by patient hands. Surgical knives wrapped carefully in linen. Edges still faintly bright beneath the rust. Nothing here felt abandoned in panic. It felt paused, as if the hands that worked here had simply stepped outside for air and never returned. He ran his fingers over the tables. Sticky residue clung faintly to the wood. Syrups. Tinctures. The labor of people who had refused to watch others die without trying. Bandages lay folded in neat stacks, crutches carved smooth by long use. Notes scattered across a desk described symptoms in cramped script, chills at dawn, rash like bruised plums, coughing blood, remedies attempted, vinegar washes, willow bark, smoke of juniper. He could almost see them. Brothers bent over beds, sleeves rolled, whispering prayers and measurements in the same breath. Faith and experiment braided together like rope. Not sorcery, not heresy, just desperation. When plague sweeps through a countryside, God feels very far away, and hands become the only miracles left. He nodded to himself. Yes, they had tried to heal, tried to fight what everyone else fled. But deeper in the chamber, the air changed. Colder. Stiller. He noticed the stone slab in the floor only because his boot struck its edge. A rectangle darker than the rest. Scratches along the seam. He knelt and pushed. It shifted. Slowly. Reluctantly. The sound of stone grinding against stone echoed too loudly in the room. Beneath it, darkness. And iron. Cages. Not large enough for animals. Not wide enough for a man to lie flat. The bars were thick and close, rust blooming across them like dried blood. He touched one. His fingers came away red-brown. Chains hung from the ceiling above, slack and blackened, like dead vines after frost. A ring bolt in the wall. Another. He swallowed. This was not for healing. This was containment. A ledger lay on a nearby stool, warped by damp. He opened it carefully. Names, or what passed for them. No family marks, no villages, no fathers or mothers listed. Only one word repeated down the page. Peregrinus. Wanderer. Stranger. Disposable. People no one would come looking for. People whose absence would not echo. His chest tightened. He imagined the brothers arguing in whispers. If we try, we must. For the others, if it works, we save them all. Good intentions sharpened into something cruel. Experiments. Trials. The thin line between mercy and violence crossed in the dark. How many had they bound here, praying over them while testing tinctures and cuts and doses? How many had died in the name of salvation? Outside, the marsh reeds hissed against one another, 1,000 dry whispers. Frogs croaked with slow, indifferent rhythm. The world continued. It always did. He stood and looked back toward the infirmary shelves, the careful jars, the folded bandages. Compassion lived here. And horror, both born from the same hands. He understood then. The brothers had not fled plague, not war. They had fled themselves, fled what they had become while trying to save others. Some sins are louder than screams. Some follow you even into prayer. The mist thickened against the windows, pressing close like breath against glass. Beyond it, the water lay dark and patient, heavy, waiting, as though the marsh had swallowed everything the monastery could not bear to bury. And as the last light drained from the sky, the physician felt a strange certainty settle over him, that if the mud were stirred deep enough, if the water were dredged and the reeds parted, the marsh would give it all back. Every chain, every bone, every name. Rising slowly to the surface, like truth that refuses to stay drowned. At sunrise, the stones glowed pale gold. For a fleeting moment, the monastery almost looked beautiful. The light slipped over the broken roof and poured through the gaps like warm milk, softening the jagged edges, turning ruin into memory. Moss caught fire with color. Wet walls shimmered. Even the cracked bell tower seemed less like a wound and more like an old scar. Morning had a way of forgiving things, of pretending nothing terrible had ever happened. Bees nested in the crevices where incense burners once stood. Their slow, lazy buzzing drifted through the nave like distant prayer. Honeycomb clung to the stone, amber and fragile, dripping sweetness onto the cold floor. The air tasted faintly of honey and damp wool. For the first time in years, the place did not smell of rot. It smelled, lived in, alive in its own quiet way. Light spread across the mosaic floor, revealing shapes long buried beneath grime, saints with broken halos, vines twisting around their feet, lambs and stars picked out in faded blue and red. Time had not erased them entirely. It had only dimmed their voices. Now, they whispered again. For a moment, it was easy to imagine the monastery as it once had been. Full, warm. The ovens smoking, the bells ringing, footsteps echoing between walls that believed in purpose. But morning lies, and children believe it. A boy from the hamlet wandered up the slope chasing a stray goat. Barefoot, skinny knees streaked with mud, hair the color of straw. He carried no fear because fear is learned, and no one had taught him this place deserved it. To him, the monastery was not a grave. It was an adventure, a story. Old women spoke of ghost monks and cursed bells and hidden treasure, chalices buried beneath floors, rings sewn into robes. He had listened wide-eyed at the hearth, imagining gold and secrets. Now the goat had slipped through the broken gate, and he followed without thinking. His laughter startled a cluster of birds from the tower. They rose in a sudden cloud, wings beating like pages torn from a book. He stepped inside. Dust motes spun in the sunlight. The bees hummed. Somewhere water dripped, steady as a clock. He wandered past the cloister garden, now wild with weeds. His toes brushed the stones where herbs once grew. Sage for fever, rue for sorrow. He didn't know their names. To him, they were just plants. He tugged at a tapestry hanging half-eaten by moths, curious about the faded image woven into it. The fabric tore with a soft sigh. Behind it, a narrow corridor, hidden. waiting. Cold air slipped out, smelling of earth and something chalky, like old bones left too long in the sun. He hesitated only a moment, then slipped inside. Children trust darkness more easily than adults. They have not yet learned what it can hold. The corridor walls were rough, pale dust clinging to his fingers when he touched them. He rubbed his hands together, watching the chalk drift down like snow. Cells opened on either side. Small rooms. Bare. Straw scattered on the floor. He imagined the brothers who once slept there, men with soft voices and heavy robes. He pictured them brewing ale in copper pots, tending bees, writing prayers by lamplight while the world outside froze. He did not know their fears, only their shapes. A wooden spoon lay near one doorway. Smooth. Polished by years of porridge and soup. He picked it up, turned it in his hands. It felt warm somehow, as if it remembered being held. He slipped it into his pocket like treasure. A relic without meaning. Then the corridor tilted downward, steps carved into stone. Narrow, uneven. The light behind him weakened with each step. The bees' hum faded. The air changed. Stale. Heavy. As if no breath had passed here for years. He slowed. Not from fear. From instinct. Animals know when they burrow too deep. At the bottom stood a door bound with iron bands. Dark wood swollen with age. The lock broken long ago, hanging open like a loose tooth. But the wood bore scratches. Deep. Desperate. Lines carved from the inside, as if something had clawed and clawed, trying to reach the air beyond. His small hand hovered over the surface. He traced one groove. His finger fit perfectly inside it. The mark of a nail. Or many nails. For the first time, he listened. Above, the wind slipped through the cloister arches. It made a low, humming sound. Long and hollow. Almost like chanting. Almost like voices layered over one another. Too far away to understand. He swallowed. The door creaked when he pushed it. Just enough. Light stretched inside like a thin thread, then vanished. Darkness swallowed it whole. At first he saw nothing. Then shapes. Low. Stacked. Wrapped in linen strips. Carefully arranged. Row upon row. Like sacks of grain stored for winter. But grain did not curve like that. Did not taper. Did not resemble shoulders. Or knees. Or the fragile length of a spine. His heart began to beat too loudly. Each pulse filled his ears. He told himself they were bundles. Just cloth. Just old supplies. But the silence in that room felt different. Denser. As though the air itself were holding its breath. And then, upstairs, the goat bleated. Sharp. Panicked. A sound so sudden it cut through him like a knife. He stumbled backward. The door swung from his hand. Shut. The thud echoed up the stairwell like a coffin lid closing. Dust rose. Then stillness again. Complete. He stood there, shaking, not knowing why. The humming wind above sounded less like chanting now, more like warning. He turned and ran, feet slapping against stone, breath ragged, the wooden spoon knocking against his thigh like a small, accusing bell. Outside, the sunlight felt too bright, too warm. The bees continued their gentle work, indifferent. The monastery glowed gold again, peaceful as ever, as though nothing beneath it had ever been stacked and wrapped and hidden away, as though innocence itself had imagined it all. But the boy did not look back. Some places, even to the innocent, know how to keep their secrets. And as the morning light climbed higher and the shadows shortened, the old walls held their breath once more, waiting for the next soul, curious enough to follow a stray path into the dark. Night did not fall all at once. It seeped. Slowly. Like ink dropped into water. The sky bruised from blue to purple to the deep, aching color of plum skin pressed too hard. Shadows lengthened across the marsh and climbed the monastery walls, filling the cracks, pooling in the broken windows, until the whole ruin seemed to rise from darkness rather than sink into it. By the time the last light died, the monastery no longer looked abandoned. It looked awake. Like an old scar reopened, the bell tower cut a crooked shape against the stars. They trembled faintly above it, cold and distant, as if reluctant to look too closely. Fireflies drifted through the cloister arches, blinking on and off, tiny green lights, like forgotten prayers trying to remember their words. For a moment, the air was almost gentle. Then the wind turned, and the smell returned. Damp parchment, cold ash, old smoke clinging to stone, the ghost of a scriptorium that once hummed with scratching quills and murmured psalms. The sound was gone now, but if one listened too long, the silence itself began to itch, as though something should have been there, something missing. A lantern appeared on the path. Small, unsteady. A warm bead of light moving against the dark. An old man carried it, hunched slightly, cloak wrapped tight around his thin frame. The leather satchel at his side bumped against his hip with each step. From it peeked the pale edges of blank vellum. He was no pilgrim, no thief. His hands were stained with ink, the nails permanently dark as if dipped in shadow. A chronicler, sent from the Mother Abbey. His duty had been spoken simply enough. Record what remains. Inventory the land. Declare the property lost. Close the book. He had spent a lifetime writing the histories of kings and saints. He had chronicled wars that devoured generations and miracles that bloomed like spring flowers. He had given order to chaos with ink and parchment. But as he stood before the gate, he felt something he rarely felt anymore: hesitation. As though this place resisted language, as though it would not consent to being written. The gate groaned open. The lantern light slid across the stones, waking shapes that did not want waking. He stepped inside. Each footfall echoed too loudly. He began his work out of habit, counting doors, tracing carved dates with careful fingers. He whispered numbers under his breath, the way monks once whispered prayers. 1, 2, 3. The corridors felt narrower than they should have been. Names were etched into beams near the dormitory, scratched by bored hands long ago. Matthias. Elias. Brother Pierre. He brushed the letters with his thumb, feeling the grooves. Men who had risen before dawned to bake bread. Men who copied scripture until their backs ached. Men who believed their small lives mattered to heaven. He tried to imagine their faces, but every image dissolved into shadow. In the refectory, bowls still rested where they had been left. In the garden, the outlines of herb beds were barely visible beneath weeds. The place had not collapsed dramatically. It had simply stopped, like a heart missing its final beat. He opened his ledger and made notes by lantern light. Walls cracked, roof partially fallen, bell ropes severed. His handwriting looked fragile here, uncertain. In the archive room, shelves leaned crookedly. He searched for the monastery's own records, expecting at least some closure. Births, deaths, transfers, funerals, the rhythm of endings. But the ledgers ended abruptly. Mid-year, mid-sentence, ink trailing off as though the writer's hand had been pulled away. No final entries, no last rites, no explanation. Only blank pages where years should have been. Blankness louder than any confession. He closed the book slowly. The silence thickened around him. In the chapel, the lantern light flickered against the altar stone. Something about it bothered him. The edges. Too fresh. Too uneven. He set the lantern down and pushed. The stone shifted with a low scrape. Beneath it lay bundles of parchment tied with coarse twine. Carefully hidden. Carefully forgotten. His heart began to beat faster. These were not official records. The paper was different. Thinner. Private. He untied one. The twine fell away like a brittle vein. Inside, letters. Dozens of them, written in different hands. Some neat and careful, others frantic. Ink blotched where tears or sweat had fallen. But they were not prayers, not hymns. They were written to one another. "Forgive me. I cannot sleep if we tell the bishop. It is not of God. The bones are older than the walls. We should never have dug. We must seal it. Swear silence. The earth should keep it." His throat tightened. Bones older than the monastery. A discovery beneath the crypt. Something found when they expanded the foundations. Something that shook faith itself. He pictured them digging by torchlight, expecting stone, finding instead something ancient and wrong. Not relics, not saints. Something that did not belong to any scripture. Fear had spread among them like frost, creeping silently into every corner. Not fear of plague, not war, but of knowledge, of truth that did not fit their world. Better to abandon the place than let it breathe. Better to let it rot than let heaven fracture. The lantern flame trembled. Wax dripped slowly onto the page, sealing a word forever beneath pale tears. He realized then what these were. Confessions. Testimonies. Proof. Proof that faith can break just as easily as bone. He held the letters and felt the weight of choice settle onto his shoulders. Record them. Let the world know. Or burn them. Let the secret die here. Some histories save. Some histories destroy. Outside an owl cried. Long. Low. A sound like grief pulled thin across the night. His hand hovered over the lantern, flame licking gently. Hungry. He imagined these words spreading. Questions rising. Faith cracking in villages already thin with hunger. Sometimes, silence is cruelty. Sometimes, it is mercy. His fingers trembled. At last, he gathered the letters, retied them, and slid the bundle back beneath the stone. He lowered the altar carefully, as though laying someone to rest. His decision felt heavy, necessary, terrible. He wrote only one line in his ledger. Structure abandoned. Cause unknown. Site to remain undisturbed. A lie, but a kind one. He lifted the lantern and turned away. The fireflies blinked around him, fading one by one. The corridors swallowed his steps. And when he crossed the gate, the light shrank behind him until it was only a small star against the dark. Then nothing. The monastery returned to shadow, guarding its buried heart, keeping its bones, keeping its truth. Like a wound the world was never meant to see. And somewhere deep beneath the crypt, far below stone and silence, the earth settled with a slow, patient breath. As though whatever lay hidden there was still waiting.